Hello friends, welcome to today's class. Today we are going to discuss a very important topic related to the beginning of new stone ages in world. The title of today's topic is beginning of food production, and we'll be looking this in a theoretical perspective. There are certain objectives of today's topic. Throughout the topic, we'll be looking at the meaning of domestication processes. We'll also try to understand the transition from hunting-gathering stage of human history to the agricultural stage, beginning of food production by the earliest societies, and lastly also looking at various theoretical models which are related to the process of cultivation of various crops. The process of domestication of plants and animals was not a sudden departure from hunting and gathering activities. Change in the environmental and climatic conditions subsequently impacted the life on this planet. The change in behavior of plants and even animals and the knowledge that people gathered from the day-to-day experiences about the value of plants and animals became the important events that shaped the history of humans on Earth. Archaeologists and paleobotanists are of the opinion that humans started domestication of animals and plants during the late Mesolithic period. They started farming activities in the Mesolithic period owed to the change in the climatic conditions. Highlighting its significance, G. Clark says, the change in the relationship between men, animals and plants that precipitated the transformation of social systems was accomplished not by Neolithic humans but by the Mesolithic communities. It was precisely as an outcome of this process that men became Neolithic. The use of new ground and polished stone tools and the domestication of plants and animals with accompanying changes in the form of appearance of a village economy and society was the most significant feature of Neolithic period. In many parts of the world, gathering of food was now replaced by the food production. Food production, according to Gordon Childe, who was a very important British archaeologist, this represented an economic revolution, a greatest one in human history after the discovery of fire. Scholars have given different opinions about the process of the beginning of agriculture. These views are based on hypotheses, speculations and fieldwork which are driven by the demands of the history and the curiosity of the scholars about understanding the nature of cultural transformation that history witnessed following the end of the ice ages. The discovery of large settlements and cemeteries shows the unprecedented growth of villages, and population indicated that now they were culturally equipped to deal with the exigencies of nature. However, there were other questions to be asked also. For example, did agriculture begin at a particular place and time and get diffused elsewhere then? Secondly, were plants and animals domesticated simultaneously or one after another? And there are several more questions like this which comes to the mind of a scholar. The main assumption of the above questions is that agriculture had been accepted by large sections of the people in different parts of the world. It was generally believed that people in general had given up primitive ways of food gathering like hunting and gathering, and they had adopted some form of agriculture despite knowing that it is full of risk as new activities were mainly rainfall based farming or dry farming of the early phase. This has forced them to inspect the pros and cons of these methods of food procurement. Now, increase in population and changes in the environment and climate became an immediate factor that brought changes in the subsistence activities of the paleontological records. Altered selective pressures, they were also necessary factors that had modified human communities along with the changes in the environment. During the Pleistocene epoch, we witnessed the general shift in structure of hunting and gathering economies due to the impact of selective pressure on animals and plants as also on the evolving humans. There was not only physical impact of such changes on humans, but also psychological and behavioral impact in the form of enhanced understandings and improved social existence. The impact of the selective pressure was large and more intensive during the Pleistocene epoch than during the earlier geological epochs, and they affected large groups of people, those who were subsisting in different ecological contexts. In order to understand the transition from hunting-gathering stage of human history to the one which was completely agricultural based, scholars have given different views about this transitional phase of human history. Now, in order to understand the history of the beginning of this agricultural system throughout the world, we need to take a view on some of the theories which were propounded by different scholars, including historians and archaeologists. One of the very important theories which was put forward by some scholars is known as the climate citrus hypothesis, or this is also known as the Ossis theory. The main proponents of this theory are Nikolai Vavilov, who was a Russian agronomist. The second person was C.C. Schroer, who was an American geographer, and lastly it was Very Gordon Childe, who was a British archaeologist. Those propounded this theory. They were among the first ones in the 20s of the 20th century to discuss the origins of agriculture in the ancient times. The analysis made by Gordon Childe was concerned with the material interpretation of the archaeological data. The date that was available made it clear that there was intense desiccation in southwestern Asia and North Africa and the shrinking of inland water bodies after the end of the Pleistocene epoch. In the post-glacial readaptation, the economic life of humans got changed as humans were now witnessing starvation. Thus, Gordon Childe's climate citrus is variously described as the Ossis theory, which means desiccation, or the propinquity theory, which dealt with the question that how human endeavors in prehistory were determined by the exigencies of climate. According to him, agricultural activities first began in the fertile regions of South Asia, as this area witnessed severe climatic changes. He says this area witnessed the dramatic change in weather conditions like fall in precipitation, which later resulted into droughts and which in turn created starvation. In such an atmosphere, the pressure of humans, plants and animals on Ossis therefore increased. The change in the climatic conditions created a bridge and new relationships between all three animals, humans and the plants. Childe's theory thus analyzed that beginning of farming did not take place on a worldwide scale simultaneously. They occurred in restricted areas measuring a few hundred miles. He says that the successful ideas of these experiments were then taken to the other areas of the world. Now, coming to the second important theory, which is also known as nuclear zone hypothesis. In order to study the climatic changes in the immediate post-glacial period, a fieldwork was undertaken by Robert Bradford, who was an eminent archaeologist of the University of Chicago in USA. In the 1950s, he did this experiment in the western slopes of the Zagros mountain. In this fieldwork, he was also assisted by many specialists like botanists, earth scientists, zoologists and archaeologists. An extensive investigation was made in which he ruled out any kind of drastic change in the climate of the region. But the evidences of tamed animals and plants were found by them, and according to Bradford, climate change cannot be taken as the sole cause which was responsible for the beginning of agriculture. He concludes that had climate change been the only factor responsible for beginning of agriculture, then similar change towards the domestication should have taken place during the earlier periods of interglaciation in the Pleistocene, when the climate had warmed up substantially. Since no such cultural change had been undertaken in the earlier periods, it was thus necessary to rule out climate as a crucial determinant of change in the post-glacial period. Braidwood argued that there was a gradual evolution to the stage of food production rather. Nuclear zones or natural habitats, which means the areas that had abundant animal and plant species, according to Braidwood, were the places where agriculture had perhaps started. His team determined the date of the various sites where early food production had been undertaken through the availability of the carbon-14 dating method. Near the Jarmo, which is a very important Neolithic site, Braidwood found wild but edible animals and plants that people were still dependent on. Villages got evolved here only after 2000 years later. Based on such evidences, he projected a nuclear zone theory that was applied to various cultural levels in the beginning, with food gathering till the food procuring stage through cultivation. According to him, this process of change had to be seen in the context of changing human culture, which he defined in terms of ever increasing cultural differentiation and specialization of human communities. He says that this did not have happened earlier, as there was no such culture ready to receive it. This, according to Braidwood, happened at the end of Pleistocene period, when humans started exploiting this natural habitat for their own advantage. The combination of changes in human behavior provided a platform for the transition of economy from hunting and gathering to the beginning of agriculture production. Like Gordon Childe, Braidwood too considered agriculture a revolution and a very important human achievement which had made security and leisure possible for the prehistoric people. However, in this cultural model, the assumption that the strength of human nature caused the beginning of agriculture remains untestable. Now, coming to another theoretical model which is known by the term demographic hypothesis. Cultural hypothesis was here challenged by another archaeologist whose name was Lewis Benford, when he postulated that it was only the pressure generated by the rise of population that led to the beginning of agriculture. He differentiates between internal and external demographic pressures. In Benford's view, population is likely to increase in optimal areas, which means those areas that are well provided for. The rise in the sea levels at the end of Pleistocene pushed that population of hunters and gatherers towards water bodies where they took interest in fishing, like in the coastal areas of Peru and southwest. Now, change in subsistence activities led to the increase in the population even beyond carrying capacity of the environment. Demographic pressure was maximum on the borders of those optimal habitats. These areas were inhabited by less sedentary groups of hunter-gatherers. The coming of more sedentary groups from the optimal zones upset the equilibrium between food resources and the population. The external demographic pressure, that is the population pressure, which was caused by the migration of these new people from other areas rather than a biological increase in numbers, caused a shortage of food availability to subsist on. The imbalance thus created by the population explosion made an adaptive shift in the economic activities necessary. Thus, beginning of farming was probably than a direct outcome of population pressures following the Pleistocene climate changes. Cultivation of crops and immigration were fractional solutions to deal with the existing problem therefore. However, when the population increased, the internal pressure on resources is met through domestication of plants and herding of animals. The upland valleys of Mexico and its surrounding valleys, he says, immigration was restricted by the high mountain walls and the tropical jungles that surrounded the valley. The problem created by the increase in the population was managed through internal adaptation. Human resource rather than environmental change was more important for the beginning of agriculture according to Mark Cohen. He agrees with Esther Boserup that demographic change contributes to intensive farming. Boserup had argued against the Malthusian theory of demographic change that dependence on agriculture causes an increase in population. According to Mark Cohen, population of hunters and gatherers led the expansion of areas and infiltration of people in marginal areas to the extent that the avenues for further expansion were exhausted. He says once the already existing avenues got exhausted, people started cultivating crops. In other words, agricultural knowledge had increased considerably during the different stages of Mesolithic period. But it was not undertaken because enough labor was not available for it. People could not continue with hunting and gathering because they felt the lack of hunting zones at the end of Pleistocene period, which forced them to go for intensive farming, which could be done with additional input of labor. This explanation highlights the significance of population expansion throughout prehistory and not just during the post-Pleistocene epoch. Now coming to the another theoretical model which is known as ecological hypothesis. Like other theories, climate stress model too received rejection from Carl Sauer. Instead of climate theory, he offered an ecological model in which human involvement was given utmost primacy. His arguments were based on certain questions. So like farming activities does not arise due to non-availability of food. People on the verge of famine do not have enough time to experiment with improving food plants. Second, the hearths of domestication are to be found in areas of marked diversification of plants and animals. Regions characterized by both diversified terrain and a variable climate. Now thirdly, the areas marked by floods and aridity like river valleys were not the places where domestication had started. Fourth, instead he says earliest agriculture was practiced in wooded lands perhaps. Fifth, people who had already achieved skill of cultivation had started domestication of animals therefore. And lastly, the people who started agriculture were living a sedentary life and only sedentary can start farming as it needs constant attention. And this constant attention was necessary or otherwise it would have invited predators and led to the loss of the harvest. Sauer stresses more on the Mesolithic period where the evidences of earlier settlements were found near oceans and water streams. The people living in close proximity of water bodies were catching fish. Thus, in his estimate, the first agriculturists may have been the fishermen. This theory also received support from Robert McAdamus. According to Adamus, fishing proved beneficial for the people as it was time-consuming activity and allowed bigger sedentism and enabled people to remain in a very specific place for a longer time. The leisure time that fishing provided now inspired them to exploit the neighboring regions for plants. The earliest farmers used vegetative copy, that is victimization of root crops or by stem cutting and replanting, and therefore learned to plant before they learned to sow. The initial crops were ginger, yams and bound palms corresponding to sago, sugarcane, etc. And similarly, dogs, pigs, geese and ducks were initially domesticated animals. The difference in occurring these two staples, fish and grain, one offered in water and therefore the alternative on ground at a time once populations were step by step rising, inspired and advanced towards bigger dependence on farming. Carl Schurr claimed that he had adopted an ecological model because he was involved with finding the early herds or centers of food production. In his water source centered model, he gave importance to root crop agriculture or seeding and therefore the diffusion of the thought of domestication from this geographical region to Southwest Asia. This model ultimately remains untested aside from the components of Southeast Asia. Now coming to another theory which is known as the social hypothesis theory. The scholars of social model theory draw upon social compulsions of exchange. Therefore, the people were compelled to conduct feasts and ceremonies in order to garner social ties. The members of the prehistoric society were drawn into a relationship of barter and exchange in food. Thus, exchange was therefore the propulsion behind increasing sedentariness of society based on food production. These new arrangements provided a junction towards bigger social cooperation and sharing and so reduced the chance of starvation. According to academicians like Barbara Bender, who was writing sometime in 1975, he says that population increase does not occur in a vacuum. Demographic levels are affected by a number of additional factors also, such as the kind of subsistence activities which are available, the state of technology, the distribution and exchange patterns and etc. According to her, adaptive tactics and people's method of obtaining food only change when social interactions do change. Brian Hayden has argued that agriculture played an important role in augmenting the leadership role of people who, with success, competed with others in organizing feasts for the members of the group. And these individuals increased their social standing and status by organizing feasts and reducing the component of risk of famines and starvation. Now lastly, we will be coming to the systems model, which is also propounded by some scholars related to the transition from the hunting-gathering model to the agrarian society. This systems model was propounded by Binford and Harris as well as Kent Flannery, who have used a gradualist perspective to describe the change from hunting and gathering to agriculture. Darwin's depiction of the earliest stages of farming in 1868 is where the viewpoint originated. It emphasized the similarities between hunting, gathering and agriculture rather than the differences. Binford and Flannery did make a distinction between food production and food procurement, which was what hunter-gatherers accomplished. However, because they were analyzing the combination of environmental, demographic and cultural elements, in order to explain the change in systemic terms, they also placed a focus on continuities. In order to explain the shift to agriculture in the southern uplands of Mexico as well as the Zagros Mountains, Kent Flannery used this systems idea. He said that hunter-gatherers were able to encounter the flora and wildlife of many zones because of their seasonal mobility. Due to the negative feedback theory, which states that different plants accessible in different regions ripened at different times, hunter-gatherers arranged their hunting-gathering approach accordingly across the southern uplands of Mexico. The variety of plants and animals that were available controlled the movement and size of the group. As a result, people started to rely on a broad spectrum economy rather than one that was focused on a few number of plants and animals. So, students, this is all what we have to understand about the transition from the hunting gathering stage of humans to the ones those who started procuring and producing rather their own food. I hope you have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you so much.